There was another socialist political party who didn't believe in any compromise with liberals, the Bolsheviks. To them, World War I was a competition between greedy imperialist capitalist countries, and they did not want Russia to have any part of it. Their eternal truculence landed most of their leaders in prison, but the Tsar's downfall meant freedom, and freedom meant they could return to the cities to join the revolution. Those were the Bolsheviks lucky enough to be imprisoned in Siberia. Some of their leaders had been kicked out of the country altogether, particularly Vladimir Lenin, who was living in Switzerland, but he returned to Russia with a little help from Germany. The Germans put Lenin on a sealed train car, where he was ferried past European battlefields. In April 1917, he arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd. Germany hoped Lenin would stir up enough trouble in Russia to knock them out of the war. Lenin's Russian opponents immediately accused him of being a German agent, an accusation he was never able to totally shake. They might have been wrong about Lenin being a German agent, but the Germans weren't wrong about him being a troublemaker. Lenin's message to the Bolshevik Party was clear: don't work with the provisional government. Don't compromise with the liberals. He wrote an essay, the April Theses, that laid out the Bolshevik plan. One of the slogans of the April Theses was peace, bread, and land. Peace meant an end to World War I. Bread meant an end to starvation. Land meant redistributing farms to the peasants. Lenin's opponents feared he meant to stir up class war, turning the poor against the rich. Russia's poor were getting restless. Factory workers elected committees to challenge the power of owners. Peasants confiscated land from the wealthy. Soldiers challenged their officers' orders. To top it all off, the provisional government ordered the military to launch an attack on the Germans. It was a disaster. Russian soldiers fled back home with new horror stories from the front. Protests broke out in the streets of Petrograd. Some protesters demanded the Bolsheviks seize power. Lenin was caught off guard. He failed to take decisive action. Meanwhile, the provisional government didn't. Its new leader, Alexander Kerensky, crushed the protests. He blamed the Bolsheviks, threw their leaders in jail, and accused Lenin of being a German agent. Lenin left the country again, sneaking across the border into Finland. The Bolsheviks didn't start the protests, but they certainly got the blame for it. Meanwhile, the middle-class, wealthy, and liberal parts of Russia were concerned with the growing restlessness in the streets. The supreme commander of the Russian army, General Vladimir Kornilov, intended to overthrow the provisional government. He could restore law and order, and then lead Russia to victory against Germany. Unfortunately, his coup never really got off the ground. Troops refused to follow his orders. Train operators refused to bring his men into Petrograd. Kornilov was arrested and took full responsibility for his actions. There is a chance that Kerensky might have known about the coup ahead of time and maybe even encouraged it. But once the people showed they were against it, he had to stop it. By this point, the provisional government looked weak. Between protests in the streets, coups from the generals, and losing the war to Germany, it didn't look like they could do anything right. Meanwhile, membership in the Bolshevik Party skyrocketed. People who were elected to those worker, peasant, and soldier councils more and more identified as Bolshevik. Their popularity forced the provisional government to release Bolshevik leaders from prison. They gained a reputation as the only true defenders of the revolution. One of the Bolsheviks released from jail was Leon Trotsky. He organized bands of armed workers, Red Guards, to defend against another Kornilov affair. Trotsky became one of the most respected Bolshevik leaders, second to only Lenin himself. Lenin was still hiding out in Finland when the Bolsheviks scored their biggest victory yet, control of the Petrograd Soviet. At this point, Lenin dusted off an old slogan from the early days of the revolution: all power to the Soviets. From his hideout in Finland, Lenin wrote essays encouraging the Petrograd Soviet to seize power from the provisional government. And why not? The Red Guards gave them the guns, and the Petrograd Soviet gave them the power. It was even safe enough for Lenin to return to Petrograd. In October 1917, Red Guard units filed into the streets. They took over key points in the city and surrounded the Winter Palace where the provisional government met. Kerensky quietly escaped out of a side exit. Lenin's moment had arrived. The Bolsheviks were in control of Russia. For the first time, a group of self-professed communists took over a government. What would that look like? Time would tell.